It's a little bit later with this, but I have my second top 10 of the season as I look forward to the College Football Playoff Committee releasing their brand new top 10 this Tuesday night. So as you can see on the board behind me, I have my new top 10. And the top 10 was bound to make a shift this weekend as we had two top 10 matchups, including the game of the season so far between number 1 Alabama and number 3 LSU. So let's quickly go through these rankings as you can follow along on the board. Number 1, I have Alabama. Their 20-0 victory over number 3 LSU on the road this past weekend. They had their first test of the season, and they passed it easily. They got about 100%, maybe even a 97% because of the one interception, probably some false starts that early in the game that kind of left them out of some points. But still, they easily passed the test. Alabama stays at number 1. At number 2, I have Notre Dame. The Irish, they were somewhat tested against Northwestern. Northwestern just didn't go away, and Notre Dame didn't have that game wrapped up until the very end. So the Irish remain number 2 in my top 10. At number 3, I have the Clemson Tigers. Now, I understand that there is going to be some debate or some argument on why I have Notre Dame at number 2 instead of Clemson. And the reason for that is because if you look at these two teams and what their resumes are so far, you look for the quality and the quantity. So let's look at Notre Dame's convincing, their schedule resume. A win over Michigan, a win over Stanford, and a win over Virginia Tech. Those are the three toughest teams that Notre Dame has faced so far this season. And Clemson's three toughest teams are Texas A&M, Syracuse, and NC State. So if you look at these, they both have the same amount of quantity of convincing wins, which is 3 apiece. But you just got to look at the quality of these. Texas A&M has found themselves in the top 25, but the last 2 weeks, they just looked really flat. They just couldn't close out. They couldn't win either the last 2 weeks, so they're on a 2-game losing streak. So A&M kind of climbed their way into the top 25. Stanford's kind of climbed their way into the top 25. Virginia Tech's been in the top 25 throughout the season. So Virginia Tech has really not done that much after that. Neither is A&M. A&M did go on a mini winning streak, but they're now on a 2-game losing streak. So you just look at, and I understand that Stanford hasn't really done much either. They've kind of made an appearance in the top 25 about a week ago, but things just aren't looking too well for Stanford right now either. But the thing that everyone misleads is they forget there's 2 equations through this. Like when you play a certain team, you got to look at these 2 things. What they were ranked when you play them and how they do after that. However, where they're ranked when you play them, that is what people tend to forget about. They tend to only remember how they do after it. But you have to do both in these situations. Notre Dame played Stanford when they were number 7. Clemson played A&M when they were unranked. And this is before A&M even made an appearance in the top 25. And they also played Syracuse when they were unranked. Nobody really knew that Syracuse was going to tear off some wins after that loss to Clemson. Nobody would have guessed that. So when you look at this, Syracuse has technically only played 1 ranked team so far this season. Notre Dame has played 3. They played Michigan as a ranked opponent. They played Stanford as a ranked opponent. And Virginia Tech as a ranked opponent. So Notre Dame has technically beaten 3 ranked opponents this season. And Clemson has only beaten 1. But that's the first piece that you look at. And then you got to look at, do they progress or do they regress? And you just got to understand that Clemson does win this argument. They win this kind of argument because Virginia Tech and Stanford, they've both regressed after they've played Notre Dame. But you can't only include that. You got to include the other piece as well. So both of these teams are 1 apiece in this argument. But what the difference is the quality And the quality that Notre Dame has that Clemson does not is that Notre Dame has a win over Michigan, who's number 4 in my top 10. So that's why Notre Dame is number 2 instead of Clemson, because of the quality and also the quantity. They each have one apiece in the quantity, but Notre Dame overtakes them in the quality. So Notre Dame 2, Clemson 3, Michigan 4. So it just seems like if those 4 teams went out, it looks like those are going to be the 4. So let's look at 5 through 10 to see which teams are fighting to get back into this race. At number 5, I have Georgia. Number 6, Oklahoma. Number 7, Washington State. Number 8, UCF. Number 9, Ohio State. And making an appearance in the top 10, West Virginia at number 10. So let's look at 5 through 10 real quick. Georgia is back at number 5. They're kind of climbing their way back into the rankings. Georgia has had 2 consecutive weeks of beating a ranked opponent. Oklahoma, they're starting to climb their way back in there. If they win out, they're still in the fight. Washington State at number 7. The surprise team of college football this year so far. Grad transfer Gardner Minshew. He's really doing a good job with Washington State. Their only loss was a close one to USC. In a game they probably should have won, it did have a controversial call in there. So who knows what it would be like if they were able to pull that game off against USC. Number 8, UCF, who I feel like should at least be in the top 10 this week. I was very surprised that UCF was not ranked in the top 10, that a 2-loss Florida team was ahead of them. And now that Florida lost again, I hope the committee actually puts UCF in the top 10. Of course, they're probably going to work their way around it, not putting UCF in the top 10. In fact, it won't surprise me if they put a 2-loss LSU team in the top 10 over UCF. And if that happens, I'm going to be pissed. Because UCF, they're still winning games. You don't win all these games by mistake. You don't win these by accident. And let's quickly call a spade a spade. Let's just say Alabama played UCF's schedule. Let's just say that was the case. Even if they were winning these games against these quote-unquote nobody teams, these group of 5 teams, you would still want Alabama. They would still want Alabama in the college football playoff for 2 reasons. 1, because it's Alabama and the brand that they have. And 2, because of the historics that Alabama has done. They would still want Alabama in the college football playoff because you don't mark against Alabama for playing Mercer in November. You don't mark them for playing the Citadel in November. You don't criticize them for playing McNeese State during the season. You don't criticize them for playing Idaho. You don't criticize them for playing, I don't know, Fresno State or UNLV. You don't criticize Alabama for those games because of what Alabama provides for college football and the dynasty and Nick Saban and the brand they provide and the money their fans will use to travel. But since we're talking about UCF and they don't have a brand in college football like Alabama does, they have to knock UCF for it every single week. And UCF, they proved how good of a team they were last year by beating Auburn in the Peach Bowl. Sure, you can argue and say that Kerryon Johnson wasn't 100%. Well, it doesn't matter. UCF won that game convincingly. They moved the ball at will against Auburn. So, in fact, let's mark it down right now. I'm willing to go along with this thing and say that the committee will still find a way to put a 2-loss LSU team in the top 10 and screw over UCF once again this week. It's probably going to happen. Anyway, moving on. Number 9, Ohio State. They just survived the upset bug against Nebraska. In fact, I think Ohio State is lucky to have this game. They should have lost the game easily because I was watching that game and Nebraska, they left about 13 or 14 points off the board, whether it would be for them or going against Ohio State. And if Nebraska played mistake-free football, they probably would have won the game. And yesterday for Nebraska football, I've been really harsh on Nebraska football as well as UCF throughout kind of my entire time here on Johnny Talk Sports. And yesterday, it was finally that day where the Nebraska football team earned my respect. I mean, they went on the road compete in a hostile environment against a top 10 team, a team that still has national championship contentions, and they almost beat him. I know that almost only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades, but you just got to think about what Nebraska has been through lately, with all these different coaching changes and a bad start to the season, but their fans are hanging in there. They are still hopeful and optimistic, and I have respect for Nebraska football now. Am I still going to want to win national championships? Not really. But if they do, I'm going to still respect them. Like, I'm not going to jump on the Nebraska bandwagon or anything, but I'm just going to still have the respect for them. Am I going to root for them in a lot of games? Probably not, but still, I have the respect for them. I feel like it's a little bit closer now to when the rebuild could probably... I know it's still a rebuilding process, but it could end in the next maybe year and a half. I feel like this is a huge momentum booster for Nebraska football moving forward. But I know you want to think about the what-ifs. But what if this is the turning point of Nebraska football? In fact, it easily could be. We'll even see what happens throughout the end of the season. Because Nebraska still has some games left against Illinois that's pretty much winnable. Michigan State, that honestly they could have a fighting chance. If they played the way they did against Ohio State, they could probably beat Michigan State and Iowa as well. So they've got 3 games left to salvage what could be left of the season. So Nebraska football is now earned my respect. And number 10, West Virginia, who is now making a run into this top 10. West Virginia still has a shot to get into this college football playoff. In fact, in preseason, they were my dark horse to make the college football playoff. And West Virginia is coming off a win over Texas in a thrilling fashion. Dana Holgorsen going for 2 to take the lead and ultimately win the game with 15 seconds left. And this could be the start of a Will Grier run to the college football playoff. This would be something. Could this be the turning point that West Virginia has? They're coming off they came off a bad loss against Iowa State. They just practically beat them up. And for West Virginia to come back and just a couple weeks later and win a big game against Texas, that's huge for West Virginia, and it's huge for the Big 12. So let's go over 2 scenarios real quick. Let's just assume that Alabama, Notre Dame, and Clemson went out. So those 3 went out, and you've got the Big 10 champion and the Big 12 champion and Washington State all winning out. So you've got to leave out 2 of these teams in this scenario. So if you want to grab a piece of notebook paper or something to write this down, you can go ahead. So let's write the following. Alabama wins out. Let's put them at 1. Notre Dame wins out. Let's put them at 2. Clemson wins out. We're putting them at 3. So then put that on the left side of your paper. And on the right side of your paper, put Michigan/Ohio State as the Big 10 champion. We're going to assume that the winner of that Ohio State and Michigan game at the end of the regular season wins the Big 10 championship. They're qualified to be one of the 4. And let's also put OU/West Virginia in there. Because let's assume the winner of that one will win the Big 12. Because remember, the Big 12's a round robin. So Oklahoma and West Virginia will still play each other in the regular season, and they could possibly play each other again in the Big 12 championship. So let's assume the winner of that OU-West Virginia game, they win out, they win the Big 12. They're qualified to be one of the 4. And let's put Washington State in there. They win out, they win the Pac-12. They're qualified to be one of the 4. And, just for the heck of it, let's just put UCF in the right as well. So you've got those teams. You could probably eliminate UCF. Unfortunately, the committee will find a way to eliminate UCF. But UCF does have some big games coming up. They got games that will be challenging for them. They had a win against Temple the other day. You can argue and say Temple's not that good of a team. They give up a lot of yards. But Temple had a winning record. Temple's not that bad of a team. They were a quiet 5-3. They pull off an upset against Cincinnati when they were number 20. So UCF isn't that bad of a team. And let's not also forget that Pittsburgh pull off an upset against Virginia this past week. The same Pittsburgh team that UCF just demolished. And that could also be a key factor, because if the season ended right now, Pittsburgh would be in the ACC championship game. So you could put UCF in there. So you've got to leave out at least two of these teams. Who are you putting in? Are you putting in the Big Ten champion, the Big 12 champion, Washington State, who probably could deserve to be there? Or are you putting in UCF, who probably a lot of people feel like shouldn't be there? So you're leaving out, at least, at the very worst, or very best, depending on what you're looking at. You're either leaving out the Big Ten champion, or you're leaving out the Big 12 champion. And that could be a conflict that the committee will have to face as this process winds down. So that's for you to decide at this point. For me, I would probably put the Big Ten champion in there. I could say it could depend on what it was. If Michigan was the Big Ten champion, you could probably put in Michigan. Because Michigan, they have the resume. They've got the schedule. They've got the convincing wins. Over probably the Big 12, because you could say that Oklahoma may not have the resume, or West Virginia may not have the resume. But it could be close, depending on how you're looking at it. Especially if everything falls into place. You're assuming that neither of these teams lose ever again throughout the end of this process. So it could be close between that Big Ten champion and the Big 12 champion. Or should the committee just say, screw it, let's do something we've never done before. Let's have 4 and 5 compete in a play-in game on December 22nd. Or do we do that? Or do they do something they've never done before, just do that? That'd be a sight to see. As far as what I think it would happen, I think it would depend on which champion it was. I feel like if it was Michigan, they would go with Big Ten. If I feel like if it was Oklahoma, it could go to Oklahoma. But does Ohio State carry that brand that the College Football Playoff Committee wants? They had no problem leaving out Ohio State last year, and they probably aren't afraid to do it again. Even though I feel like Ohio State should have been left out with 2 losses, it just shows that when it comes down to 2 blue blood teams, they go with the one they think provides the most ratings and revenue. So that could also go into a factor, whether or not it's the Big Ten champion or the Big 12 champion that gets left out in this scenario. Okay, one more scenario real quick. On that left side of the paper, if you're writing it down on paper, let's go with Notre Dame wins out. Let's go with Clemson wins out. And let's go with the Big Ten champion, the Big 12 champion wins out. And let's also add in that Georgia wins out as the SEC champion, which means, guess what in this scenario? Alabama has 1 loss. So what do you do? So you've got on the paper, Notre Dame wins out, Clemson wins out, Big Ten champion, and Georgia as an SEC champion. And you've got Alabama as a 1-loss team in the SEC title game. Let's just say it's like an epic 24-21 overtime game in the SEC title game. What do they do in this scenario? Do they put in, especially if it's Ohio State that wins the Big Ten championship, and it could be a battle between Ohio State and Alabama again for that 4th spot. What would the committee do? This could be an issue that they run into it. So if you're Alabama in this scenario and you've lost, you need to argue whatever you can. You've got to argue and say that your 29-0 victory over LSU was convincing enough. And since Mississippi State's going to be ranked, so we're kind of looking ahead here. Let's just say Alabama does win out. They beat Mississippi State convincingly. You've also got to argue that you beat the number 18 team in Mississippi State. You've got to argue that one as well. And let's just say Auburn could find their way in the top 25 by the time the Iron Bowl plays out. Then you've got to also include that you beat Auburn in the Iron Bowl if they were ranked. But you got to hope that Auburn is ranked when you play them in the Iron Bowl if you're Alabama. Because that could be the difference. And you also can have the argument that you beat Texas A&M when they were number 22. So that would be 4 convincing wins right there for Alabama. Compared to Ohio State, they've beaten Penn State. They would beat Michigan in this scenario. So you really need to argue that. Well, not that the committee would care about what people say on social media, but for the people that would be pro-Alabama, that could be what it comes down to, is what those 4 wins over quality teams would compare to those 2. That could be a difference. And you could also include for Ohio State that comeback win against TCU. That's still 4-3 in this scenario. Still 4-3. So could Ohio State get left out again in this scenario? It's just something to think about. So comment your top 10 down below. Also, who would your top 4 be if it came down to it? Comment your thoughts on those 2 scenarios. And I will see you pretty soon.